I didn't need a new haircut. I needed to see my face again. There's this thing that happens when you wear glasses and have a round face, especially after 60. You start seeing a stranger with tired eyes and hair that's trying too hard to help, but isn't. I had a stylist once give me these heavy, straight-across bangs. Said they'd open my eyes. Instead, they collided with my frame so badly, I looked like I was peeking through a letter slot. I remember thinking, is this what sharp means now? That's when I realized something. It's not just about the haircut. It's about harmony. Between your shape, your features, your frames, and how you feel when you catch yourself in the mirror. This video is all about the details, bangs and layers. Small changes, but powerful ones. You'll learn how to avoid the most common mistake women over 60 make with bangs, especially if you wear glasses. And more importantly, where to begin your face framing layers if your face is round. Hint, it's not where most stylists start. Right now, you might be feeling a quiet sort of frustration, like you're doing everything right, but your haircut keeps muting you. I've been there. You're not imagining it. For women like us, style after 60 isn't about trends. It's about alignment. We want to look in the mirror and say, ah, there I am. Not, what happened? What if your next haircut didn't try to fix you, but framed you just as you are? You know, I once told a stylist, these glasses aren't going anywhere, so let's find bangs that work with them, not against them. She blinked and said, no one's ever said that to me before. I'm going to show you the exact kind of bangs that saved my face from disappearing behind the frames, and the one kind that always adds width where we least want it. And if this feels like a conversation you've been waiting to have, you're not alone. Feel free to subscribe. We have more gentle fixes and quiet victories ahead. Brenda used to stop by the library every Thursday afternoon. Tall, thoughtful, always with a tote bag of paperbacks and a soft smile. But the first time she came in after a haircut, I barely recognized her. She had thick, blunt bangs that sat just above her eyebrows and big square glasses with dark frames. All I could see was glass and hair. Her eyes disappeared behind a wall of geometry. I don't say that to be unkind. It just struck me. Her face didn't feel present anymore. It felt like a postage stamp. Everything important was pushed to the corners. So let's talk about blunt bangs. When they're cut thick and straight across, they do two things that aren't so helpful for women with round faces and glasses. They create a horizontal band across the forehead, flattening the upper part of the face. They crash right into the top rim of your glasses, crowding the eye area and cutting off vertical space. For women over 60, that's a problem. We already deal with softening bone structure and less definition around the eyes. The last thing we want is for our haircut to put a curtain over the very features we want to lift. And yet, these bangs keep showing up. Stylists offer them like they're one size fits all. But they're not. Here's what helped Brenda. She went back, asked for soft, layered bangs, ones that started higher in the middle and swept slightly to the side. They were thinner, airier. And suddenly, her eyes came back. She looked like herself again. Because here's the truth. It's not about erasing your forehead. It's about inviting your features forward. Bangs shouldn't feel like armor. They should feel like permission. I'm curious, have you ever had bangs that felt like they boxed you in? Or ones that finally framed you just right? But even lightening the bangs isn't enough if the layers are working against your face shape. And that's what part 2 is all about. My friend Susan called me one afternoon, excited. She'd just gotten a fresh cut, said she felt 10 pounds lighter. So we met up for coffee. And the moment I saw her, I knew something wasn't quite right. Her layers started right at her temples, flaring out a bit around the sides. She looked puffed, not in volume, but in shape. She kept tugging at the front pieces. I don't get it, she said. It's layered. It should slim, right? But here's the thing most stylists don't always explain, especially to women our age. If you start face framing layers too high above the cheekbone, you're adding width, not definition. It's the visual equivalent of highlighting the roundest part of the face. And for those of us with softer, fuller cheeks, after 60, it ends up creating this triangle effect, wide at the sides, narrow at the chin. Almost like cartoon chipmunk cheeks. We both sat there, trying not to say it outright. But it was written all over her face, and not in a good way. Effort without reward. And she's not alone. I can't count how many women I've met who've asked for face framing layers, thinking it'll lift and contour only to end up with something that widens instead. Here's the adjustment that changed everything for Susan. She went back and asked for the first layer to start just below her cheekbone. Not up at the temple. It gave a vertical softness, like the hair was gently holding the face instead of pushing it outward. The hair tucked in ever so slightly, and suddenly, that puffiness was gone. Because subtle makes all the difference. We don't need drama, we just need intention. And that brings us to one of my favorite quiet fixes. The kind that doesn't scream style, but makes everything feel softer. We'll talk about that next. Jane was one of those women who always had a no-nonsense haircut. Straight back, no bangs, no fuss. She taught high school English for 35 years, and her students always knew you don't mess with Mrs. Rayner. She retired at 66, took a trip, and on a whim, let a new stylist do what her old one never dared. Give her a fringe. Not a thick, choppy bang. Just a soft, feathered suggestion of one barely there pieces that skimmed the top edge of her glasses. She looked in the mirror and said, very quietly, "Oh, that's my face." Most of us were told somewhere along the way that bangs were for little girls or for covering things up. But the right kind of fringe, especially after 60, can do something else entirely. It can reveal. Think of it this way. A full fringe can block and divide. But a light, textured fringe that ends just at or slightly above your frames. It lifts, it adds movement. And it gives just enough interest around the eyes without boxing anything in. For women whose faces have softened with time, this kind of cut doesn't try to fix anything. It just frames the kindness that's already there. She didn't feel younger. She felt known, like her haircut was finally catching up to her personality. You don't need a dramatic change. Sometimes, it's just a curve of hair that lets the light back in. Have you ever had a moment like that where a small shift in how you looked gave something back you didn't know was missing? And if you're not ready for any kind of bang, that's fine too. There's one layering trick that does the same thing without touching your fringe. Let's look at that next. Diane gave up bangs the same year she gave up pantyhose. Early 52nd, no regrets. But the bob she kept neat, chin length, easy to maintain, started doing something she didn't expect. From the front, it looked fine. From the side, though, it made her cheeks look rounder. Not fuller in a flattering way, just wide. She told me once, "I feel like I've got chipmunk cheeks and a helmet." We laughed, but she wasn't wrong. Her stylist suggested one simple change. Add a single layer starting just under the cheekbone, right at the soft dip below the apple of the cheek. Not stacked, not chopped, just a gentle angle that tucked inward as it moved toward the chin. And you know what? It worked. That one layer shifted everything. Suddenly, the bob didn't just sit there, it moved. It shaped. Here's why it works. When you place a face-framing layer just below the cheekbone, you guide the eye downward. It elongates. It softens. It creates structure without making it look like you're trying to create structure. And for women who don't want bangs, who feel best with an open forehead, this trick gives you the benefits of framing, without the upkeep or commitment of fringe. You don't have to choose between clean lines and soft features. There's a middle path Sometimes, all it takes is a single layer that knows where to begin and where to stop. Have you found a way to make your haircut feel more you without adding more? I'd love to know what worked for you. And all of this comes back to one core idea. The goal isn't to look younger. It's to look like yourself again. Let's talk about that as we close. I was back at the DMV a few weeks ago. Same fluorescent lighting, same long line, same mirror above the counter, the one that caught me off guard last time. Only this time, I looked up and didn't look away. My bangs were softer now, just enough to lift without crowding. My glasses sat like they belonged on my face, not fighting for space. It wasn't dramatic, but it was different. I felt present. These little adjustments, a feathered fringe, a lower layer, a bit of movement, they don't scream new haircut. They just say, I'm still here, still me, just easier to see. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? We're not trying to look younger. We're trying to look clearer. To ourselves. To the world. Because at some point, it stops being about trends or tricks. It becomes about finding that one detail that lets the light back in. Have you ever had a haircut or just a small detail that made you feel more like you again? I'd truly love to hear it. And if this feels like the kind of conversation you've been missing, we'll be having more just like it. Feel free to subscribe. We're not done yet.